Hello, my name is Sean Briscoe, and in this presentation I will answer the question, what is policy debate? This presentation is primarily aimed at those individuals who have never judged policy debate before, or perhaps who are relatively new to judging in this format of debate, or debate at all. I think the first thing that we need to look at, though, is what is debate? It breaks my heart that in much of today's society, the things that we call debate are about as far as we can possibly get from it. Debate is not about arguments, it's not about fights. By arguments, I mean the classic yelling at one another and those types of things, fights. It's not attacks against the person, we're not trashing someone's character and those types of things. Debate is actually the process of giving reasons to aid better decisions. So we're giving reasons so that we can make good decisions in our personal lives, in government, or wherever. And we do that in a very logical, straightforward process. We present ideas, we attack those ideas to check their validity, and then we try and rebuild those ideas and see ultimately what we get at the end of the day. Also, debate is not oratory. We're not evaluating debaters based on how good they speak, how well they speak, how eloquent they are, and those types of things. But at the same time, the way that they present their ideas, how well they articulate those ideas, does inform their persuasiveness. Now, different judges have different thresholds on how much they evaluate a speaker's persuasive speaking skills. Some really pay very little attention to the presentation itself because they're looking exclusively or almost exclusively at the logic, but at the same time, you have to present your ideas in a way that can be understood. Like I said before, debate is not fighting. You're not just trying to present your own idea and ignoring what your opponent or the person that you're dealing with. In fact, like if my wife and I get into a fight, in all honesty, it's probably because we're not really listening to each other. We're not trying to understand the perspective of the other individual who's in that fight with us, right? And so to have a reasonable debate, to have a good debate, it's defined as much by agreement as it is disagreement. There are a lot of things that you have to agree with the person with whom you're debating. For example, what are we debating? That's one of the common, most obvious places where we have to have some sort of agreement before things can progress. And then you may have disagreement on the best ways to go about solving something. There may appear to be disagreement about the goals, but if you keep digging deeper, what good debaters will find is that if they can articulate a place where they and their opponent actually agree, have the same goals in mind, then they can actually shift the debate and actually have a much better developed discussion. There's also a paradox in debate in that we are both in competition and in cooperation with our opponents. Yes, when we go to tournaments, our students are trying to win ballots, they're trying to win rounds, they're trying to be crowned the champion of the tournament. Okay, but at the same time, there has to be some level of cooperation, or at least you'll find that there's some level of cooperation amongst the best teams. One of those is just simply agreeing about what we're debating about, finding common interests between the two sides in the debate and those types of things. But part of that cooperation is you'll find that the best debaters actually work with their opponents. They will help to make their opponents' ideas more clear, because that makes it easier for us to actually engage in a meaningful discussion. You'll find that the top competitors will actually share tips and insights with their opponents after the round and those types of things. And so it's a really unique format that we have, or a really unique community that we have surrounding the debate program or the activity of debate. All right, so let's look at policy debate specifically. Three of the defining features of policy debate is that you have two-person teams. So you have an affirmative team with 2 speakers on it, and you have a negative team with 2 speakers on it. Both of those speakers, or all 4 of those speakers actually, will have 2 opportunities to speak during the course of the debate. The judge's task is to identify a winning team, either the affirmative or the negative team. Policy debate is also a format that uses a single topic for an entire year. But the topics that we debate are very broad. So there's a lot of options that the debaters have in presenting their ideas. So for example, in the academic year 2014-15, the high school policy debate topic is resolved that the United States federal government should substantially increase its non-military exploration and/or development of the Earth's oceans. It's one topic, it's very broad. There's a lot of different things that you could do on that topic. Everything from cleaning up plastic in the ocean, developing aquaculture, building artificial coral reefs, offshore energy production, whether it's wind power, tidal power, ocean thermal energy conversion. You could drill for oil, explore for oil. You could do something related to Arctic exploration, international exploration. There are all types of different things that you can do on this topic. By having a single debate topic for the entire year, it allows students to really get into a lot of depth in terms of understanding the issues that are related to the topic. You'll also notice that not all of the issues are related directly to the oceans. Yes, the policy that the affirmative team is promoting would have to deal with ocean exploration or ocean development, but there will be issues of U.S. leadership in the world, economics, environmental issues, all sorts of different things will come into play as the debaters discuss this particular policy. And then another one of the defining features of policy debate is that it is heavily involved with the social sciences, the things that we would refer to as political science, international relations, philosophy, anything that falls under the realms of social sciences, government, economics, etc., are going to be discussed at some point. And then beyond that, you should also be aware that students are tasked with defending both sides of the debate topic. So in any given tournament with 4 preliminary rounds, the teams that you are watching will have debated twice on the affirmative and twice on the negative. That's important for you to realize as a judge and understand as a judge, because the students are not necessarily arguing from their own personal beliefs or their own personal convictions. They've been tasked to try and see both sides of the topic and understand both sides of the topic and present arguments in favor of both sides of the topic. And what that does for them in the long run is understand that there is validity to arguments on both sides of pretty much any issue. And remember back to when I was talking about debate is about agreement as much as it is about disagreement. When students start to understand that there's validity on both sides, it helps them to understand where people who disagree with them are coming from, which enables them to actually build bridges, to build connections with people whom they may have disagreed with in the past, and to find better solutions so that we can have a better society, better solutions, whatever the case may be. Okay. Policy debate is also said to be evidence-based. That's a bit of a misnomer, and a lot of debaters get hung up on the idea that policy debate is evidence-based and everything has to have evidence. What they're referring to when they say that is that policy debate, generally speaking, is heavily reliant upon long quotations from authors, whether it be something that was printed in the New York Times, The Economist, the National Review, the Washington Post, you name it, they're going to be quoting authors. They'll be quoting from books, newspapers, magazines, whatever. But that doesn't mean that everything that they say has to come with a corresponding quotation from an author. In fact, what generally happens in a policy debate round is in the first 2 speeches, remember there are 8 speeches, in the first 2, the debaters rely almost exclusively on those quotations. And that allows them to build a solid foundation upon which to build other arguments. And over the next 6 speeches, you will find with every subsequent speech, there should be less quotations and more of their own personal analysis, more of their own analytic argumentation, their own development of ideas, their own comparisons of the evidence and the logic that was presented from the debaters on both sides of the issue. Okay. The other thing that you should also be aware of is even though we say policy debate is evidence-based, there are many ways to present evidence in a debate round. Not everything that's evidenced comes from a quotation. It is possible to use analogies and metaphors, personal experience, and things like that to develop your ideas. But generally speaking, policy debate in the first 2 speeches are heavily reliant upon quoted evidence. And then finally, a policy debate is really about evaluating whether a particular course of action leads to more good than bad or more bad than good. Okay? In the case of the debate topics that our students are given, such as resolve that the United States federal government should substantially increase exploration of the oceans or development of the oceans, we're talking about whether or not a U.S. federal government policy would lead to more good than bad or more bad than good. If it leads to more good than bad, then the government should implement it and the judge should vote for the affirmative. But if we determine that that course of action, that plan would lead to more bad than good, then we would vote for the negative, because the government should not implement the policy. So beyond that, then, we can say that there are three basic guidelines to how the debaters approach the topic. The first basic guideline in policy debate is that the affirmative team has the burden to support the resolution. They've been tasked with affirming the resolution, and the negative has been assigned the burden of refuting the affirmative. 95% of the time, they will most likely disagree with the resolution. They will refute the resolution as well as the affirmative team. But in reality, their only task is to refute the affirmative. The third guideline is that there are a set number of speeches that take place in a predetermined order with predetermined times. So we know the order of the speeches and how long those speeches are supposed to be. The first four speeches in the debate are the constructive speeches. The first affirmative constructive, the first negative constructive, the second affirmative constructive, and the second negative constructive. All of those speeches are 8 minutes in length. And like I said before, the first affirmative constructive and the first negative constructive are heavily rooted in quotations, and they're laying a foundation for the debate. In the second affirmative constructive and second negative constructive, they're building those ideas, they're adding depth to those ideas, they're attacking their opponent's ideas, and then they're rebuilding against the attacks that their opponents have levied. Okay. You will also notice that there are 4 cross-examination periods that are 3 minutes in length. Those cross-examination periods are not really an opportunity for debate to occur. It's a time for clarification. It's when the opposing team stands up to ask the speaker about anything that they maybe were unclear about, that they missed. They can get clarification, because ultimately we cannot have a good debate if we don't understand what our opponents have said. And so we give the students this cross-examination period so that they can ask those clarifying questions. Then we finish up the debate with 4 rebuttal speeches. The first negative rebuttal, first affirmative rebuttal, second negative rebuttal, and second affirmative rebuttal. Those are all 5 minutes in length. There are 2 major differences between a constructive speech and a rebuttal speech. Obviously, one of them is the time. Constructives are 8 minutes, rebuttals are 5 minutes. But the second difference, or major difference, is that those rebuttal speeches are not supposed to have new arguments presented in them. So we have no new arguments in the rebuttal speeches. Now, it's important to understand what a new argument is, because some people think that that means we can only say what has already been said earlier in the debate round, but that's not exactly true. Okay, we are not saying that for the last 20 minutes of the debate, we have to listen to repetition. We have to hear things that were already said in previous speeches. Okay? We can have extensions of ideas. We can have extrapolations of ideas. We can develop ideas further. What we can't do is change the course of the debate and say, oh, I didn't realize that that was a bad line of argumentation. I'm going to answer your argument in this way. Okay, that would be shifting the playing field, shifting in a new direction. You are allowed to say, well, no, your attack against my response is incorrect because. Okay, and even though that what comes after the because is new to the debate, that would not be considered a new argument per se. Okay, so those are the 3 basic guidelines that our debaters are going to follow when they take part in a policy debate round. And then there's also some prep time. Depending on the league, they could have 5 to 10 minutes of prep time. It all depends on where you are in the country, really. But that's essentially like calling a timeout. And the convention says that you only take your preparation time immediately before your team is about to give a speech. So if I'm on the negative, I would most likely take preparation time before the 1NC, the first negative constructive, the 2 in C, the second negative constructive, possibly before the 1 NR, first negative rebuttal, but that's highly unlikely because I just had a whole bunch of prep time while my partner was speaking, and then some preparation time before the second negative rebuttal. Okay, so I could take my prep time in any way that I see fit as long as it's before one of my speeches. Okay, talking about policy discussions. Any policy debate or policy evaluation is really going to come down to 2 basic questions. First, is the affirmative plan necessary? And second, do the advantages of the plan outweigh the disadvantages, or do the benefits outweigh the costs? There are some sub-questions associated with that. For the first question, is the affirmative plan necessary? We'll evaluate it through 2 sub-questions. First, can I identify a problem? What is happening in the world that needs to be fixed? And second, can I identify the cause of the problem? Identifying the cause of the problem is important because you can't fix something if you don't know what's causing it. Or it's unlikely that you can fix something if you don't know what is causing the problem. And then the second question, do the benefits of the plan outweigh the costs, also has 3 sub-questions. The first being, will the proposal actually work? Will it make the world better as it relates to that problem? Second, are there any additional consequences? This is where you'll evaluate things like the unintended consequences, like maybe passing environmental legislation, while it solves an environmental harm, might have economic consequences, economic harms that we might want to avoid. But you can also have additional consequences from the affirmative perspective as well, additional advantages. You might be dealing with an environmental issue, but maybe you could have an advantage of U.S. leadership in the world, promoting U.S. leadership, and maybe there's good related to that. Okay? And then the third sub-question is, are there any opportunity costs? By choosing this course of action, do we lose the opportunity to do something else that would actually be better? Those are 3 sub-questions related to the question of, do the benefits of the plan outweigh the costs? When you answer all of those questions, you will ultimately arrive at the answer to the big question of whether or not the plan leads to more good than bad or more bad than good, and hence, who should win the debate, the affirmative or the negative. Okay, this is the same thing that I just showed on the previous slide. Policy debaters sometimes use a lot of jargon. If you're a new judge, hopefully they won't use a lot of jargon, but they might. The policy stock issues, we have a policy topic and then we can break it down into the problem and the solution. On the problem side, you have the harms, the bad thing that's going on in the world, and then the cause of it. On the solution side, we can talk about whether or not the proposal will actually fix the problem or at least mitigate the problem, make it a little bit less severe. But then there are also those things like the advantages and the disadvantages, those other consequences of passing the plan or choosing that course of action. So let's look at this through an actual example. If we had the debate topic, should the U.S. federal government establish a national traffic safety law, or that the U.S. federal government should establish a national traffic safety law, we might come up with a plan of implementing a nationwide 55 mile per hour speed limit, like we used to have when I was in elementary school and middle school. Okay. On the problem side, we'll ask the question, does a problem exist? Well, the first thing that we might look at is that sub-question of what is causing the problem right now? Well, in the status quo, in the present system, states are allowed to establish their own speed limits. As a result, we have some states with 55 mile an hour speed limits, some with 60, some with 65, some with 75, and some that are 85, 90. Montana used to be safe and sane. And even this past summer when I was driving from Montana into Wyoming, we went from, 85 miles an hour down to immediately 60 miles per hour. Okay, so we have various different speed limits. Some of them are really high, some of them are relatively low, and as people cross borders, maybe we have traffic going at very different speeds, as people don't realize that the speed limit changed. Then we can start talking about the harms. And we can say that high-speed accidents increase the likelihood of death. Okay, and that manifests itself in a couple of different ways. One, if the speed limit's 70 miles per hour and you get into an accident on the highway at 70 miles per hour, the damage is going to be more severe than if you were only traveling at 55 miles per hour. But likewise, when you live in a city or an area where you're crossing borders all the time, think the Northeast, or that example that I used of Montana to Wyoming, where the change in the speed limit is quite abrupt and quite significant, you can end up with traffic going at radically different speeds along the interstate, and the more variance there is, the more likely it is that you're going to have an accident in the first place. Now, is that problem significant? Here, we'd simply be looking at the number of accidents that occur, the number of deaths on the highways. So in the first question, harms, we were talking about a qualitative harm. What types of things are happening? And then on the significant side, we're evaluating the numbers, the quantitative harm that's out there. So that's the problem. And then we're going to look at the solution. Is change desirable? Well, the first thing that we have to evaluate is whether or not change will reduce the harm. Will the proposal work? And we could say, well, sure, we would actually decrease the number of deaths and the number of accidents on our highways by having a common standard and lowering the speed limits. Okay, there's actually two things that are changing. One, a lower speed limit, and two, a common standard across the country. And so that's going to decrease the number of accidents and the severity of accidents that actually occur. Now, the final big question is, do the benefits outweigh the costs? Do the advantages outweigh the costs? Or the advantages outweigh the disadvantages? Well, in the harm story, on the problem side, we've already talked about lives that are going to be saved. But we can also evaluate various other issues as well. Perhaps the affirmative is going to bring in a discussion of economics. They might say, you know what, cars are more efficient at 55 miles per hour, which means they're burning less gasoline, which means individuals have more discretionary spending because they're traveling at lower speeds. We might also be able to bring up an economics argument that says that by having a lower speed limit, it's less wear and tear on the highways, which means we have to spend less money to repair the interstates. The negative might push back on that argument and say there's an economic consequence. As you travel slower and there's less damage to the highways, then we're spending less money on that repair, which means construction workers are losing their jobs. So you can have some pushback there. We can also talk about environmental impacts. We can talk about the idea that traveling at more efficient speeds means we're burning less gasoline, which means there's less carbon dioxide, less nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, whatever. There's less pollution, less low-level air pollution, less greenhouse gases being emitted into the atmosphere, and we have environmental benefits. And then you might also have arguments about federalism, that one of the unintended consequences is that in the status quo, we've said that this is a state power, and this is just another example of the federal government reaching into the state's business and dictating to the states what they ought to do. And so you can have a lot of different issues coming up to ultimately answer the question, are we better off after the plan, or are we worse off after the plan? Now, what are the negative team's contributions? Because primarily in that previous graph, or that previous chart, excuse me, I was looking at the issue through the lens of the affirmative, the stock issues of developing a case to show how the plan will lead to positive ends. Now, the negative is going to push back on that. They're going to mitigate it. They're going to say, you know what, the number of accidents maybe is overstated, the number of deaths is declining, and so forth. So they're going to mitigate the affirmative's arguments. But mitigation alone in a policy debate is not going to win them the debate, because ultimately, if the affirmative is going to lead to good, then you would still vote for the affirmative. I loved it back when I was a junior in college at the Collegiate National Championships. Southern Illinois University was in the final round of the national championship against Fort Hays, Kansas. And they had a case that was claiming to save hundreds of thousands of lives. And for about a minute and a half, one of the debaters from Fort Hays, Kansas was pestering the 1AC about their ability to save all of those lives. And finally, the debater from Fort Hays looked out at the auditorium. Again, it's the final round of the national championship, and there's several hundred people in the audience, and he says, do you really expect all of these people to believe that your plan can save all 200,000 lives of those people? And the debater from Southern Illinois University looked out and he said, no. If I save one life here today, my job is done. It was a powerful line that just goes to show that if the negative only mitigates the affirmative, they will not win the round. They have to have some offensive arguments. And there are four primary offensive arguments that negative teams may introduce to the debate. The first is a tactic known as contravention, or a strategy known as contravention. Debaters will use the language case turns, that they're looking at the affirmative and saying, instead of making the problem better or making the problem less severe, you actually make it worse. If I think back to the World Universities Debating Championships a few years ago in Turkey, the debate topic was that the media should show the full horrors of war. And the affirmative, the opening pro team from Harvard, laid out a case that said that we need to see the full horrors of war because it will ultimately ensure that we are taking part in just wars. Well, the winning team from the World Championships from Sydney stood up and ran a case turn, saying the problem with showing the full horrors of war is that it actually scares people out of taking part in critical missions. It was the Black Hawk Down case turn, okay? Got up and argued that by showing the full horrors of war, people will see their own servicemen and women dying in the streets, and then they will not want to be there in the first place. And so when you talk about just war theory, you're actually decreasing the likelihood that the Western powers or any power who's behaving responsibly and trying to help the world is actually going to stay away and not get involved for fear of having this type of damage done to your own people, or these types of loss of lives done to your own people, and so forth. Excuse me. The second type of offensive argument is that of the unintended consequences. Debaters, again, will refer to disadvantages. So if you had a debate topic such as we would ban tobacco products, you can imagine that the affirmative would have arguments related to public health, the health benefits of banning tobacco. But the negative might come in with a disadvantage that says that you would damage the economy in any number of ways by passing this policy. That when you ban tobacco products, farmers who grow tobacco would lose their revenue. The people who process tobacco into cigarettes, smokeless tobacco, whatever, they lose their industry. Businesses that sell tobacco products lose that revenue. There are many different places that the economy is going to suffer when you pass the affirmative plan. You might have alternative policies or counterplans being discussed. Typically, the negative would look and say, you know what, we agree that the problem exists, but we don't think your way of solving the problem is actually a good one. We think there are better ways of addressing this problem that would be more advantageous or would avoid the disadvantages that we've presented in the debate round. And so ultimately then, this alternative policy would be superior to the one put forth by the affirmative team. Typically, if a team runs a counterplan, they should prove the antithesis of the resolution true, meaning that they should be outside the bounds of the topic, they should be non-topical, but that's not necessarily a requirement. They might be able to convince you that they can support the resolution and just refute the affirmative team through their counterplan. And then finally, alternative perspectives. Debaters refer to these as critiques. This is where they look at the thought process, the language that their opponents have used, and they say that you're coming at this debate round or you're coming at this issue from a flawed perspective, and that has its own harms upon the world and should be rejected. So those are the four types of offensive arguments that you may hear negative teams present in the round. They might show that you make the problem worse, a case turn, that there's an unintended consequence, a disadvantage, that is more severe or has bigger impacts or more likely impacts than the harms that you're trying to solve for the affirmative, that there might be a counterplan that's a better solution, a better proposal, and that maybe there's an alternate perspective which is more beneficial than the perspective used by the affirmative team. Ultimately, though, at the end of the debate, what you're evaluating is whether or not the affirmative proved that their proposal leads to more good than bad, or whether the negative team proved that the plan leads to more bad than good.